Arrogant boss Demotes single dad in office unaware he's the secret company owner. The conference room went silent the moment Marcus Webb set his coffee cup down on the polished table, hard enough that the sound cracked through the air like a gavel. "You're done, Daniel," Marcus said, straightening his tie with the kind of smugness that came from a man who had never once doubted his own importance. "Effective today, you're moving down to the mailroom. Half your salary. And frankly, you should be grateful I'm not walking you out the front door." Around the table, 11 people sat frozen, eyes darting between the two men, nobody daring to speak. Daniel Reyes, 42 years old, wearing the same gray button-down he'd worn to work for the last 6 years, said nothing at first. He just looked at the termination letter sitting in front of him, his name typed at the top in bold, cold letters. "Nothing to say?" Marcus pressed, leaning back in his leather chair like a king surveying his court. "That's what I thought. Guys like you punch in, you punch out, you collect a paycheck. You're not built for leadership. Never were." Daniel finally looked up. His eyes were calm, too calm for a man who had just been humiliated in front of his entire team. "Is that everything?" he asked quietly. Marcus blinked, thrown off by the lack of a reaction. That's everything. Security will help you clear out your desk." Daniel nodded once, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. But right before he left, he turned back, and for the first time in 6 years, something shifted in his expression, something the people in that room had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not sadness. Something closer to quiet certainty. "You should probably check your email before you go home tonight, Marcus," Daniel said. And then he walked out, leaving behind a room full of confused faces and a boss whose smug smile had just started to falter. 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Daniel Reyes was, by every outward appearance, the most unremarkable man at Halden Consulting Group. He arrived at 8:15 every morning, never a minute later or earlier. He wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, kept his head down, ate lunch alone at his desk, and left at exactly 5:30 to pick up his 8-year-old daughter, Mia, from after-school care. He'd worked in the analytics department for 6 years, quietly processing numbers nobody else wanted to touch, never asking for a raise, never complaining, never standing out. To his coworkers, he was just the quiet guy. Nice enough. Kept to himself. Nobody knew much about him, other than the fact that he was raising his daughter alone, ever since his wife Elena had passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness. He didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much of anything, really. He just worked. What nobody at Halden Consulting knew, what nobody could have guessed by looking at his worn shoes and second-hand car, was that Daniel hadn't always been the quiet guy. Before Elena got sick, before the medical bills and the sleepless nights and the slow unraveling of the life he'd built, Daniel Reyes had built 2 companies from nothing and sold them both. He'd walked away from the tech world at 35 with more money than he knew what to do with, and for a while, he hadn't known what to do with himself either. Then Elena's diagnosis came. And everything else stopped mattering. For 3 years, Daniel poured himself into being present every appointment, every treatment, every terrifying middle-of-the-night hospital run. When she passed, he was left with a grieving 8-year-old, a hole in his chest the size of a house, and absolutely no desire to go back to the life of boardrooms and headlines he used to live. So he did something nobody expected. He took a regular job. A quiet one. Somewhere he could clock in, clock out, and be home in time to tuck his daughter into bed. Somewhere nobody would recognize his name, because he made sure of that too. He used his mother's maiden name, Reyes, instead of the name that used to be on magazine covers a decade ago. What Daniel hadn't planned on was that 6 months ago, quietly, and through a holding company nobody at Halden Consulting could trace, he had bought the entire firm. He hadn't told anyone. He didn't want special treatment. He didn't want people to change how they treated him. He just wanted to really observe how the company he now owned actually treated its people when nobody thought the owner was watching. And what he found, slowly and painfully, was that a man named Marcus Webb, the regional director, had turned Halden Consulting into something closer to a fiefdom than a workplace. Marcus was 48, tall, expensively dressed, and radiated the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. He'd inherited his position through connections rather than merit, married into money, and treated the office like his personal stage. He wasn't cartoonishly evil. That was what made him dangerous. He was the kind of boss who smiled in meetings and stabbed people in performance reviews. He played favorites without apology, mocked people's clothes and cars in ways he thought were just jokes, and had an almost instinctive radar for who in the office had the least power to fight back. And Daniel, quiet, humble, single dad Daniel, was exactly the kind of person Marcus's radar loved to find. It started small, the way these things always do. "Reyes, can you stay late tonight?" "I need those reports by morning," Marcus said one Tuesday afternoon, not as a question, but as an order, dropped casually as he walked past Daniel's cubicle. "I have to pick up my daughter at 5:30, Daniel said evenly. "I can come in early tomorrow and have it done by 9. Marcus paused, turned, and gave a small laugh that had no warmth in it. "Must be nice," he said, "having an excuse to leave early every single day. Some of us actually have careers to worry about." He walked off before Daniel could respond, leaving the comment hanging in the air like smoke. A few coworkers glanced over, uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. That was how it worked at Halden. Nobody said anything. The comments kept coming. Little cuts, delivered with a smile, impossible to report to HR because each one on its own seemed almost harmless. "Reyes, that shirt again? We do have a dress code, you know. I'm just saying, if you want to move up around here, appearances matter. Must be tough affording daycare on your salary. Have you thought about, I don't know, getting a roommate? I need someone who can really commit to this company. Not someone whose priorities are elsewhere." Each time, Daniel absorbed it, quietly, the way water absorbs a stone dropped into it, a small ripple, then stillness again. He wasn't weak. Anyone who looked closely would have noticed that his silence wasn't defeat. It was restraint. But nobody looked closely. Nobody except one person. Her name was Priya Chandran, and she worked 2 cubicles down from Daniel in the analytics department. She was 26, sharp, hardworking, and had been passed over for a promotion 3 times in favor of employees Marcus simply liked better, usually younger men who laughed at his jokes and golfed on weekends. Priya had noticed something about Daniel that most people missed. When there was a genuinely difficult problem, a broken formula, a client crisis, a system that nobody else could untangle, people quietly brought it to Daniel's desk. Not Marcus's chosen favorites. Daniel. And somehow, every single time, he solved it within the hour, calm as ever, never asking for credit. "You know," Priya said one afternoon, sliding into the empty chair beside Daniel's desk, "you fixed the Hendricks account discrepancy in 20 minutes. Our senior analyst spent 3 days on that and never figured it out. How do you do that?" Daniel shrugged, not looking up from his screen. "Guess I just see patterns." "That's a pretty big pattern to see," Priya said, studying him for a moment. "You ever think about applying for something higher up? You clearly could." "I like where I am," Daniel said simply, and something about the way he said it made Priya drop the subject. But she kept noticing things after that. The way Daniel spoke, when he did speak, always precise, always thoughtful, like a man used to being listened to. The expensive but understated watch he wore, the only thing on him that didn't look secondhand. The way, once, she'd overheard him on the phone in the stairwell, voice low, saying something about quarterly board reports before he noticed her and ended the call abruptly. Small things. Quiet things. Nothing that added up to anything definite. Just a feeling that there was more to Daniel Reyes than the gray shirts and the empty lunch table suggested. The gut punch moment came on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the day Marcus would announce Daniel's demotion. There was a janitor at Halden Consulting named Walter, an older man in his 60s who had worked there for almost 15 years. Walter was kind in the quiet way that people become kind after a lifetime of hard work. He remembered everyone's names, always had a joke ready, and had, more than once, stayed late to help Daniel carry boxes when Daniel was working overtime on a project. Walter had a grandson he was raising, much like Daniel was raising Mia, after his own daughter had struggled with addiction and lost custody. That Thursday, Marcus called an all-staff meeting in the main lobby, ostensibly to discuss cost-cutting measures. What it actually turned out to be was Marcus publicly announcing that the janitorial staff's hours were being cut in half, effective immediately, to save the department's budget, a budget that, everyone in the room knew, mostly went toward Marcus's own expense account and the top-shelf liquor cabinet in his office. "I know change is hard," Marcus said, standing in front of the assembled staff with his hands in his pockets, "but sacrifices have to be made somewhere. We can't keep carrying dead weight around here." Walter stood near the back of the room, saying nothing, his cap in his hands, his eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel watched him. He watched the older man's jaw tighten, watched him swallow whatever he wanted to say, watched him nod along like everyone else, because men like Walter didn't get to argue with men like Marcus. Not if they wanted to keep the little they had left. After the meeting, Daniel found Walter in the supply closet, quietly restocking paper towels, his hands slightly unsteady. "You all right?" Daniel asked. Walter let out a breath. "Half my hours, Daniel. I've got my grandson at home. I don't know how I'm gonna." He stopped himself, shook his head. "Sorry. Not your problem." "It's all right," Daniel said quietly. "You've got a lot on your plate." Walter managed a small smile. "You're a good listener, you know that? Most folks around here don't even see me. You always say hello. Ask about my grandson." He paused. "That matters more than you know." Daniel didn't say much else. But something in his expression, something Walter didn't catch and nobody else was around to see, hardened just slightly. It was the look of a man quietly filing something away. That night, Daniel went home to his small 2-bedroom apartment, made dinner for Mia, grilled cheese and tomato soup, her favorite, and sat with her at the kitchen table while she told him, in exhaustive 8-year-old detail, about a science project involving volcanoes. He listened to every word like it was the most important thing in the world, because to him, it was. After she went to bed, he sat alone at the table with his laptop, and for the first time in 6 months, he opened a folder he'd been avoiding. A folder labeled, simply, Halden Q3 Review. He spent the next 2 hours reading through financial reports, HR complaint logs that had been quietly buried, and turnover statistics that painted a clear picture. Under Marcus Webb's leadership, Halden Consulting had lost nearly a third of its junior staff in the last 2 years. Employee satisfaction scores, which the previous owner had actually tracked, had cratered. And buried in an expense report Daniel almost missed, there was a pattern of inflated client entertainment charges that lined up suspiciously well with expensive dinners that had nothing to do with actual clients. Daniel closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long moment. He thought about Walter's unsteady hands. He thought about Priya, passed over 3 times. He thought about his own quiet humiliations, delivered with a smile in front of coworkers who were too afraid to say anything. And he thought, finally, about what Elena would have told him to do, because she was always the one who pushed him to stop hiding, back when he still had the chance to matter. He made a decision that night. He just didn't tell anyone yet. The final incident before the demotion happened 2 days later, in the break room, in front of nearly a dozen employees. Daniel had brought a photo of Mia to put on his desk, a small, unremarkable thing, a school picture in a plain frame. Marcus spotted it on his way to refill his coffee and picked it up without asking, turning it over in his hands like an object of mild curiosity. "Cute kid," Marcus said. "She know her dad's about to lose his job?" The room went quiet. A few people actually stopped what they were doing. Daniel looked up slowly. "Excuse me?" "Relax, I'm kidding," Marcus said, though the smile on his face suggested he wasn't entirely. "But seriously, Reyes, your numbers have been fine, but fine doesn't cut it anymore. I've got decisions to make about restructuring, and I need people who bring more to the table. People with presence. Leadership energy. You know what I mean." "I've hit every target for 6 years," Daniel said, his voice level but firm in a way people hadn't quite heard from him before. "Targets aren't everything," Marcus said, setting the photo frame back down, slightly off-center from where it had been. "Perception matters too. And frankly, Daniel, the perception around here is that you're coasting. Comfortable. Not hungry anymore. Guys like you get complacent once life happens to you. He gestured vaguely, as if Elena's death and Mia's existence were minor inconveniences that had derailed a promising career. I need hungry people. Not guys just trying to survive the day. Daniel picked the photo frame back up, straightened it gently, and set it exactly where it had been. I'll take that under consideration, he said quietly, and turned back to his computer. But Priya, watching from her desk, saw something in his hands. The faintest tremor, not fear, but the kind of controlled restraint of a man holding back something enormous. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But she remembered it. 3 days later came the meeting where Marcus announced the demotion in front of the whole team, the coffee cup slamming down, the termination adjacent letter, the mailroom, the half salary. Daniel's quiet exit. His strange, calm parting words. You should probably check your email before you go home tonight, Marcus. Nobody in that room understood what those words meant. Marcus certainly didn't. He finished the rest of his afternoon feeling pleased with himself, made a few calls, left the office at his usual 5 o'clock, congratulating himself on cleaning house. He didn't check his email until he was home, glass of scotch in hand, feet up on his expensive leather ottoman. When he opened his laptop and saw the subject line, his stomach dropped before he even opened it. Notice of ownership transition, Halden Consulting Group. From the office of Daniel A. Reyes, managing owner. Marcus read the email 3 times before the words actually settled into his understanding. It was formal, precise, and utterly devastating in its calm tone. It explained, in clean corporate language, that Daniel Reyes, under his legal name, Daniel Andrew Reyes Hallstrom, founder of 2 previous technology companies, had acquired Halden Consulting Group 6 months prior through Meridian Holdings, and had been quietly reviewing internal operations since. It stated that, effective immediately, there would be a full leadership review, beginning with the regional director position. It requested Marcus's presence at a 9 a.m. meeting the following morning in the main conference room. Marcus's hand was shaking slightly as he set down his scotch. The next morning, the office buzzed with a nervous, electric energy that nobody could quite explain, because word had somehow already spread, the way word always does, that something was happening. Employees whispered in hallways. Priya arrived early, unable to shake the feeling that something enormous was about to unfold, though she had no idea what. At exactly 9 a.m., Daniel Reyes walked into the main conference room. He wasn't wearing the gray button-down this time. He wore a simple, well-tailored dark suit, not flashy, but unmistakably expensive, the kind that fit a man who had once worn suits like it for a living. He looked like a different person, and yet, somehow, exactly the same. Calm. Controlled. Unhurried. Marcus was already seated at the head of the table, pale, his usual swagger nowhere to be found. Around the table sat the senior leadership team, along with, at Daniel's specific request, Priya and Walter, both of whom had been quietly asked to attend without being told why. Good morning, Daniel said, setting down a leather folder and taking a seat, not at the head of the table, but in a normal chair, the same way he always had. I imagine most of you have questions. I'll try to answer them. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Daniel, this has to be some kind of mistake. There's no way I bought this company in January, Daniel said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Through Meridian Holdings. I chose not to announce it because I wanted to understand what this company actually looked like from the inside, not the version that gets presented to owners, but the real version. The one employees experience every day. He paused, looking around the table. I've spent 6 years at this company, watching, listening, and for the last 6 months, confirming what I already suspected. This is insane, Marcus said, his voice climbing. You're an analyst. You've been an analyst this whole. I built and sold 2 companies before I was 35, Daniel said simply, no anger in his voice, just fact. I stepped away from that life when my wife got sick. After she passed, I needed something quiet. Something where I could just be a dad and clock in and out like anyone else. I never expected to end up owning the company I worked for. But 6 months ago, when Meridian's fund manager brought me an acquisition opportunity, and I saw the name Holden Consulting, I thought it might be interesting to see this place through fresh eyes. Or old eyes, really. Since I already had a seat at every meeting. The room was dead silent. Marcus's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. I've reviewed the HR complaints filed against you over the past 2 years, Marcus, Daniel continued, his tone still even. 14 complaints. Not one resulted in any formal action. I've reviewed turnover data. Under your leadership, this office has lost 31% of its junior staff. I've reviewed expense reports that don't add up. And I've watched, personally, how you treat people who can't defend themselves. He glanced, briefly, toward Walter. Cutting janitorial hours in half while your own expense account tripled. Mocking employees' financial situations in front of their colleagues. Telling a widowed father raising his daughter alone that he's not hungry enough. Marcus's mouth opened again, but no words came out. I gave you every chance to just be decent, Daniel said quietly. Every single day for 6 years, I watched how you treated people, and I kept waiting to see if it would change. It didn't. Daniel, please, Marcus said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier arrogance. I didn't know. If I'd known who you, that's exactly the problem, Daniel said, and for the first time, something sharper flickered across his face. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect. You didn't respect me because you thought I was beneath you. You disrespected Walter because you thought his hours didn't matter. You held Priya back 3 times because you liked people who flattered you more than people who were actually good at their jobs. He let that sit in the air for a moment. The problem was never that you didn't know who I was, Marcus. The problem is who you are, regardless of who's watching. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Daniel opened the leather folder in front of him. Effective today, you're being removed from your position as regional director. Given the severity and pattern of documented misconduct, this termination is for cause, and it will be reflected accurately in any reference checks going forward. He paused. I want to be clear, this isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. There's a difference, and I intend to hold on to that difference in everything I do from here forward. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs seeming to remember how to move a half-second late, and walked out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed felt like the room itself was exhaling. Daniel turned to the rest of the leadership team. I know some of you enabled Marcus's behavior because you were afraid of losing your own positions. I understand fear. I'm not going to pretend I don't. But going forward, I need you to understand something important. Silence in the face of cruelty isn't neutral. It has a cost, even if that cost isn't always visible right away. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. I'm not going to fire everyone who stayed quiet. Most of you were scared, not malicious, and I think there's a difference worth honoring. But I am going to be watching, going forward, how each of you chooses to use whatever power you have. That's true for me too. There was a shift in the room, a kind of exhale of relief mixed with something like shame. A few people looked down at the table. Nobody spoke. Daniel then turned to Walter, who had been sitting quietly near the back the entire time, looking as though he wasn't sure he was supposed to be there at all. Walter, Daniel said, and his voice softened considerably. Your hours are being restored, effective immediately, and backdated with full pay for the time they were cut. And I'd like to talk to you, separately, about a facilities supervisor position. Better pay, better hours, and frankly, this company should have promoted you years ago. Walter's eyes went glassy, and he nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Thank you, he finally managed. You didn't have to do all this. You told me something a few weeks back, Daniel said. You said I was a good listener. That it mattered more than I knew. I want you to know it went both ways. Then Daniel turned to Priya. You've been passed over 3 times for promotions you were qualified for. I've read your performance reviews. They're excellent. I'd like to offer you the newly vacant regional director position, effective immediately, on a 90-day trial basis with full authority, after which we'll make it permanent assuming things go the way I expect they will." Priya stared at him, stunned. Daniel, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Daniel said, the faintest smile appearing on his face for the first time all morning. "And then prove me right. I don't think that'll be hard for you." "Yes," Priya said, laughing despite herself, somewhere between shock and disbelief. "Yes, obviously, yes." The room, which had been so tense only minutes before, softened into something warmer. A few people even smiled. It was the first time in longer than anyone could remember that a meeting at Halden Consulting had ended with something other than dread. Over the following weeks, the office slowly transformed. Priya, true to her reputation, turned out to be an excellent leader, fair, sharp, and unwilling to tolerate the kind of casual cruelty that had defined Marcus's tenure. Walter took over as facilities supervisor and, within a month, had reorganized the janitorial staff's schedules so effectively that overtime costs actually dropped. Employees who had been quietly miserable for years began, slowly, to relax. Daniel didn't move into a big corner office. He didn't change how he dressed, beyond wearing the suit on the days he had ownership meetings. Most days, he still showed up in his gray button-downs, still left at 5:30 to pick up Mia, still ate lunch quietly at his desk, except now, people actually stopped by to talk to him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One afternoon, about 2 months after everything had happened, Priya knocked on the open door of Daniel's office, a modest space he'd chosen specifically because it was the same size as everyone else's. "Can I ask you something?" she said, stepping inside. "Of course. Why didn't you just fire Marcus the day you found out what he was doing? You had the evidence. You could have done it the moment you closed the acquisition." Daniel thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because evidence on paper isn't the same as watching it happen. I needed to see who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. That's true for Marcus, and it was true for everyone else too." He paused. "And honestly, I think I needed to remember what it felt like to be underestimated. It's easy to forget, once you've been on top, what it's like to be dismissed. I didn't want to forget that. I don't think power should make you forget that." Priya nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," she said, "I always thought there was something different about you. I just never guessed it was this different." Daniel smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Turns out the quiet ones usually have the most going on. People just don't bother to look." As for Marcus, Daniel didn't destroy him, though he certainly could have. He gave an honest reference reflecting the documented issues, but he didn't go out of his way to blacklist him across the industry. Months later, Daniel heard through a mutual contact that Marcus had taken a much smaller position at a different firm, one with far less authority, far less room to mistreat people without consequence. Whether Marcus had actually learned anything from the experience, Daniel never found out for certain. But he'd given him the accurate truth of his own record, and what Marcus built from there was up to him. That evening, Daniel picked Mia up from after-school care, same as always. She climbed into the car, backpack half falling off her shoulder, chattering about her volcano project, which had apparently exploded, quite literally, during a rehearsal at home the night before, much to her delight and her father's mild dismay about the kitchen ceiling. "Dad," she said, as they pulled out of the parking lot, "Priya said you're in charge of everything at your work now. Is that true?" Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Something like that. Are you gonna be different now? Like, a different kind of dad?" He thought about the question more seriously than she probably expected him to. "No," he said finally. "I don't think so. I think I'm gonna try to be exactly the same kind of dad. Just maybe a little more useful to some other people along the way." Mia seemed satisfied with that answer, and went back to describing, in vivid detail, exactly how much baking soda volcano lava had ended up on the kitchen floor. Daniel drove home through the familiar streets, past the same gas station, the same small grocery store, the same worn crosswalk where he always slowed down out of habit. Nothing about his evening looked any different than it had 3 months earlier. He still made grilled cheese for dinner. He still sat at the kitchen table listening to every word his daughter said like it mattered, because it did. The only real difference now was that somewhere behind him, in an office building he quietly owned, a handful of people were finally being treated the way people deserved to be treated all along, not because someone forced it, but because someone had finally decided to notice. Being underestimated, Daniel had learned, wasn't always a weakness. Sometimes it was the quietest kind of power. There was the power to see exactly who people really were, long before they ever knew who you were at all.